There's a strip of gravel behind a tire shop in southern Ohio where nobody goes except stray cats and rain. The concrete pad cracked years ago, and through one of those fractures, a plant with lavender-purple flower spikes climbed into the light this past June. Nobody sprayed it. Nobody noticed it. That plant, Galega officinalis, goat's rue, is the biological ancestor of metformin, the most prescribed diabetes medication on Earth. Medieval European healers brewed it for what they called sugar sickness, centuries before anyone understood blood glucose. French pharmacologists extracted its guanidine compounds in the 1920s, and the rest became pharmaceutical history. Your great-grandparents might have known it by name. Soldiers carried notes about it in wartime foraging guides, and right now it's growing behind a tire shop. One plant on this list has over 2,000 years of documented medicinal use across 3 continents. Another was literally carried by Olympic athletes and dismissed as a driveway nuisance. Let's begin. So let's talk about goat's rue, the metformin ancestor, because this is where the entire story of modern pharmacy and ancient medicine collides in a single plant. Galega officinalis has been growing across southern Europe, Western Asia, and parts of North Africa for millennia, and for most of that time, the people living alongside it understood something that took formal medicine centuries to catch up with. In medieval Europe, herbalists documented its use for what they described as excessive thirst, frequent urination, and wasting, the classic presentation of what we now call type 2 diabetes. They didn't have the vocabulary of insulin resistance or blood glucose regulation. They had observation, generations of observation. And what they observed was that preparations of this purple-spiked legume seemed to ease the symptoms that were otherwise a slow death sentence in a world without endocrinology. The plant itself is unmistakable once you know what you're looking for. It grows between 2 and 5 feet tall, with compound leaves arranged like little green ladders along the stem, and those distinctive dense clusters of purple to white flowers that bloom from early summer into fall. Crush a leaf and the smell is sharp, almost pea-like. It's a legume, after all, in the same family as clover and alfalfa. The texture of the stems is slightly hollow and ridged, and the whole plant has a vigor to it, pushing up through poor soil, gravel margins, railway edges, and disturbed ground where almost nothing else bothers to grow. It looks like something between a wildflower and a survivor. Here's the molecular story that makes this plant extraordinary. Goat's rue contains galagine, a guanidine compound. In the 1920s, French researchers investigating traditional remedies isolated this compound and found it had measurable blood sugar-lowering effects. That discovery led to the development of synthilin, one of the first anti-diabetic drugs, and eventually to metformin, a big one-eyed drug that is now prescribed to tens of millions of people worldwide. One clinical pharmacology review described the lineage plainly. Metformin's origin traces directly to the traditional use of Galega officinalis in European herbal medicine. The plant is, in the most literal sense, the grandmother the pharmacy forgot to credit. And here's the twist that makes this story sting a little. You cannot patent a plant. The moment pharmaceutical science confirmed what herbalists had been saying for centuries, the commercial incentive shifted entirely toward the synthetic derivative. Metformin could be manufactured, standardized, bottled, and sold. Goat's rue could not, at least not in a way that fit the modern pharmaceutical model. So the plant was quietly left behind while its synthetic descendant became a global blockbuster. The knowledge didn't disappear because it was wrong. It disappeared because it couldn't be monetized. Now, a critical qualification: raw goat's rue is not something you casually brew into tea. The plant contains galagine in concentrations that can be toxic, particularly to livestock. The name goat's rue comes partly from historical reports of poisoning in grazing animals. This is a plant you grow for education, for understanding the lineage of modern medicine, for the sheer power of holding in your hand the biological origin of the world's most prescribed diabetes drug. It is not a self-medication project. It's a history lesson with roots in the ground. Think of it as a living museum piece, proof that the pharmacy started in the soil, even if it doesn't want to admit it. If that one surprised you, the next plant comes from a completely different direction. A mountainous corner of China where people were living past 100 and scientists wanted to know why. Jiaogulan, the immortality herb, has one of those origin stories that sounds like a myth until you look at the data. Gynostemma pentaphyllum is a climbing vine native to southern China, and it first caught wide attention in the 1970s when a national census revealed something unusual in Guizhou province. Certain rural villages had remarkably high concentrations of centenarians, people living past 100 in communities where modern healthcare infrastructure was minimal at best. Researchers began investigating what these populations had in common, and one factor kept surfacing: the daily consumption of a local tea brewed from a wild vine the locals called jiaogulan, sometimes translated as the herb of immortality. In the wild, jiaogulan grows as a creeping or climbing vine with 5-lobed leaves arranged in a delicate star pattern. It thrives in shaded, humid environments, forest edges, mountain slopes, the kind of places where mist settles in the morning and the air smells like wet stone and green things growing. The leaves have a slightly sweet, almost grassy taste when chewed fresh, and the texture is thin and tender, nothing like the tough, leathery leaves of many medicinal plants. It's gentle in the hand, which is fitting, because its action in the body appears to be gentle too. Not a sledgehammer, but a slow, persistent support system. The compounds responsible are called gypinicides. And here's where the science gets interesting. Gypinicides are structurally similar to ginsenosides, the active compounds in ginseng, but jiaogulan contains a far wider variety of them. Some estimates put the number at over 80 distinct gypinicides compared to roughly 28 ginsenosides in Panax ginseng. Peer-reviewed trials have documented effects on lipid metabolism, antioxidant activity, and adaptogenic stress response. And one clinical study published in a phytotherapy journal found that jiaogulan extract significantly improved markers of metabolic health in participants over a 12-week period. Another review described its adaptogenic profile as comparable to ginseng, but with broader chemical diversity. People use it primarily as a tea. The dried leaves steeped in hot water, sometimes multiple infusions from the same leaves, because the flavor stays gentle and the compounds keep releasing. So in traditional Chinese practice, it's considered a QE tonic, supporting energy and endurance without the jittery intensity of stimulants. The practical scenario where jiaogulan fits is the long game, not acute illness, but the kind of sustained, low-grade support that adds up over years. Think of it less like a rescue medication and more like a retirement plan growing in a hanging basket. And it can literally grow in a hanging basket. Jiaogulan is surprisingly easy to cultivate in containers, tolerating partial shade and moderate watering. It's not a demanding plant, which makes its obscurity in the West all the more striking. This is a vine with documented longevity associations, peer-reviewed metabolic research, and a cultivation difficulty level somewhere around easier than tomatoes. Why isn't it everywhere? Partly because it grows in Asian mountains, partly because it has no Western patent path, and partly because a plant that supports health gradually over decades is a terrible business model compared to a pill you take daily for acute symptoms. The knowledge is available, the vine is easy to grow, the research exists. It just never got the marketing budget. If that one feels like a slow burn revelation, the next plant is something you've probably stepped on without looking down. Herb Robert, the oxygen plant, is one of those species that grows so quietly and so commonly across temperate Europe, Britain, and parts of North America that most people register it as nothing more than a small, lacy-leaved ground cover. Maybe mildly annoying, certainly unremarkable. Geranium robertianum has been growing in the cracks of stone walls, along shaded forest paths, in the cool dampness beneath hedgerows, and at the edges of old churchyards for longer than anyone has been keeping records. And for a significant portion of that time, the people who lived closest to those hedgerows and churchyards knew it by another name, herb of grace. The plant is small, rarely more than a foot tall, with deeply dissected leaves that look almost fern-like, delicate, reddish-tinged, arranged in clusters that spread low across the ground. Crush a leaf between your fingers, and you'll get a smell that's sharp, impungent, and distinctly unpleasant to some people, musky, almost acrid, nothing like what you'd expect from something so fine-looking. The stems are reddish and slightly hairy, the tiny 5-petaled flowers pink to magenta, and the whole plant has a texture that's both fragile and persistent. It grows where other things give up, in deep shade, poor soil, rocky crevices, like a survival specialist dressed as a wildflower. Across the Balkans and the British Isles, Herb Robert was traditionally used for wound healing, nosebleeds, and inflammation. In some folk traditions, it was considered a blood purifier and a support for oxygenation, the idea being that it helped the body move and use oxygen more effectively. The basis for this traditional claim has been partly attributed to the plant's organic germanium content. Germanium is a trace element that some researchers have investigated for its potential role in oxygen utilization at the cellular level, although this is an area where the science is genuinely preliminary. Some in vitro studies have shown interesting oxygen-related effects from organic germanium compounds, but robust clinical trials in humans are lacking. This is one of those moments where honest qualification matters. The traditional use is real and well documented. The folk reputation is consistent across multiple cultures. The germanium connection is intriguing. But the modern clinical evidence has not yet caught up to the ancestral claims. That doesn't mean the traditional users were wrong. It means the research hasn't been funded or prioritized to the degree that would produce definitive answers. And that's a pattern you'll see again and again on this list. The plants that can't generate pharmaceutical profit don't generate pharmaceutical research budgets. What people do report in both traditional and contemporary herbalist contexts is using Herb Robert as a tea or poultice for minor wounds, skin irritation, and as a gentle tonic. The preparation is simple: fresh or dried leaves steeped in hot water. The practical scenario is the kind of low-grade, everyday support that never makes headlines but fills the gap between "I'm fine" and "I need a doctor." It's a blood oxygen station disguised as a garden weed. And the reason most people have never heard of it is the simplest reason of all. It's too common, too small, too quiet, and too free to ever attract the attention of anyone selling something. Next time you see those tiny pink flowers in a shaded crack, bend down. That's herb of grace. And it earned that name. Now, here's where the color changes, literally, because the next plant is golden, gorgeous, and carries a legal status that surprises almost everyone. California poppy, the legal sedative, is one of the most beautiful cognitive dissonance plants in North America. Eschscholzia californica. Say that name to most people and they'll picture golden orange fields sweeping across hillsides, the state flower of California, something pretty and ornamental and completely innocent. Say poppy, and a different association fires: opiates, regulation, danger. But California poppy is not an opiate. It's not controlled, it's not addictive. And it has been used as a gentle sedative and pain reliever by Indigenous peoples of the western United States for centuries before anyone in a lab coat ever looked at it. The Chumash, Cahuilla, and other Native American groups used preparations of the whole plant, roots, leaves, flowers, for toothache, for sleep, for calming restless children. The method was typically a poultice applied to the gums for pain or a mild tea for relaxation. This was not dramatic pharmacology. This was the kind of quiet, practical plant medicine that mothers used when a child couldn't sleep, and fathers used when a day of physical labor left their joints aching and their minds unable to settle. Visually, California poppy is unmistakable. Those satiny, 4-petaled flowers, in shades from deep orange to pale yellow, the blue-green feathery foliage, The way the flowers close at night and on cloudy days, as if the plant itself is resting. Touch the petals and they feel like thin silk. Delicate, almost waxy. The leaves are cool and slightly succulent when you press them between your fingers. The whole plant has a faintly bitter, herbal smell when broken, nothing dramatic, just a clean green scent that hints at something quietly active beneath the beauty. The alkaloids responsible for its sedative properties include californidine and protopine, compounds that interact with GABA receptors in a way that promotes relaxation without the heavy sedation of synthetic sleep medications. This is not knocking you unconscious. This is turning down the volume. German and French phytotherapy systems have formally recognized California poppy as a treatment for mild anxiety and insomnia, and it appears in approved herbal preparations across Europe. One German phytotherapy review described it as a well-tolerated anxiolytic with a favorable safety profile for mild sleep disturbances. Here's the perception reversal that matters. This plant is completely legal, easy to grow from seed, and thrives in poor, dry soil, the exact conditions most garden plants hate. It's drought-tolerant, self-seeding, and flourishes in the kind of neglected, sun-baked ground that people associate with emptiness. You can scatter seeds along a driveway edge in March and have golden flowers by June. And those golden flowers contain a gentle, non-addictive sedative that 3 traditional cultures used and 2 modern European healthcare systems have validated. Why forgotten? Because it's too gentle. In a pharmaceutical landscape built on potency, where the strongest sedative wins the prescription, a mild, non-addictive plant that promotes relaxation over unconsciousness doesn't compete. And it doesn't produce a dramatic effect that patients or doctors can point to and say, that's working. It works like a lullaby in flower form, gradual, cumulative, easy to miss unless you're paying attention to the subtleties. And that's the pattern of Act 1. 4 plants. 1 was the literal ancestor of a blockbuster drug. 1 was associated with centenarian villages. 1 might hold oxygenation secrets that science hasn't funded yet. 1 is a legal sedative people grow as decoration. In 4 weeds, or flowers, or garden curiosities, with centuries of documentation behind them. European systems, Native American systems, Chinese systems, all independently recognizing the same truth. The medicine was already in the ground. They just didn't agree on the language. If these 4 are what people dismissed, imagine what comes next. Now we're moving into the ones that hide in plain sight. The plants people buy at nurseries, plant in borders, and admire without ever suspecting what they're actually looking at. Welcome to the common revelations. Balloon flower, the lung opener, sits in ornamental gardens across the northern hemisphere, and almost nobody growing it knows they're tending one of the most respected respiratory herbs in East Asian medicine. Platycodon grandiflorus. In Korean cuisine and medicine, it's called doraji, and it's been used for over 1,500 years as a treatment for respiratory congestion, cough, and throat inflammation. This is not fringe folk knowledge. Doraji appears in the Donggi Bogum, the encyclopedic Korean medical text compiled in 1613, and its use stretches back through centuries of documented practice in both Korean and Chinese traditional medicine. The plant is gorgeous. That's part of the problem. The star-shaped flowers, typically in shades of deep blue violet, sometimes white or pink, balloon out before they open, which gives the plant its common name. In a garden bed, it looks purely decorative. The leaves are blue-green, slightly toothed, arranged alternately along upright stems that grow 1 to 2 feet tall. The root, thick, white, fleshy, with a texture like a cross between a carrot and a radish, is the medicinal part. Dig one up and snap it in half, and you'll see a milky white sap with a faintly sweet, earthy smell. That root tastes mildly bitter, slightly nutty, and in Korean cooking, it's sliced, seasoned, and served as a side dish alongside rice. Medicine woven directly into the meal. The active compound is platycodon D, a saponin that acts as an expectorant by reducing the viscosity of mucus in the respiratory tract. In plain language, it loosens what's stuck. Peer-reviewed Korean clinical studies have demonstrated its anti-inflammatory and mucolytic effects, and it has been the subject of pharmacological research exploring its potential in broader respiratory applications. One review of the existing literature noted that balloon flower root extract showed significant expectorant and anti-tussive activity in both animal models and preliminary human trials. The practical scenario is straightforward: stubborn, unproductive cough, the kind where mucus sits in the chest and won't move. Traditional preparation involves simmering the sliced root as a decoction or incorporating it into soups. In Korean markets, dried doraji root is as common as dried ginger. It's sold openly, used casually, and valued deeply, a complete contrast to its invisibility in Western health conversations. Why forgotten? Because in the West, balloon flower was imported as an ornamental. Its beauty preceded its reputation. Nurseries sell the flowers. Nobody mentions the roots. And because it originated in a medical system that Western pharmacy has historically been slow to validate, doraji got filed under decorative perennial instead of 1,500-year-old respiratory medicine that clinical studies keep confirming. It's a pulmonologist hiding in your flower bed, and the person who planted it for the purple blooms is literally growing traditional respiratory support and throwing away the most valuable part. If you're starting to feel a shift, a sense that what you've been looking at and what's actually there are two different things, good. That feeling is exactly the point. And we're only getting started. Tulip poplar, the frontier fever bark, is a tree so common across the eastern United States that most people don't even register it as notable. Liriodendron tulipifera grows in backyards, parks, along highways, and in every mixed hardwood forest from Connecticut to Georgia. It's one of the tallest native hardwoods in North America, reaching over 150 feet in old growth, with distinctive four-lobed leaves that look like someone pressed a tulip shape into green paper, and greenish-yellow flowers that appear high in the canopy where most people never see them. The bark is gray, deeply furrowed in mature trees, and if you cut into the inner bark, you'll find a bitter, aromatic layer that smells faintly of camphor and earth. That inner bark was one of the most important medicines in Appalachian folk tradition. When quinine, derived from South American cinchona bark, was unavailable or too expensive, frontier settlers and Civil War field medics turned to tulip poplar bark as a substitute. The alkaloid tulipiferine, along with other compounds in the bark, was used to treat intermittent fevers, particularly malaria, which was endemic across much of the southern and eastern United States through the 19th century. Field surgeons in the Civil War documented its use when supply lines for quinine were disrupted, and Appalachian herbalists continued to rely on it well into the early 20th century. This is where the evidence deserves careful framing. Tulip poplar's anti-malarial use is historically documented and culturally consistent across multiple generations of Appalachian practice. However, modern clinical trials directly evaluating its anti-malarial efficacy are limited. The traditional use is real, the alkaloid profile is documented, but this is primarily a historical medicine, not a clinically validated one by contemporary standards. What it represents is something equally important: the resourcefulness of people who needed fever medicine and found it in the tallest tree in their forest. The practical context is less about malaria today and more about the broader lesson. Frontier settlers didn't have pharmacies. They had forests, and from those forests they assembled a working pharmacopoeia based on observation, desperation, and results. Tulip poplar bark was one piece of that system, brewed as a bitter tea, sometimes combined with dogwood bark, used to bring down fevers and manage the cyclic chills that marked malarial infection. The preparation was simple, the tree was everywhere, and the knowledge was passed hand to hand through communities that couldn't afford to be wrong about their medicine. Why forgotten? Because cinchona won. Quinine was more effective, more standardized, and eventually more available. When the better option arrived, the backup was no longer needed, but the tree is still there. In every eastern forest, in every suburban park, the tulip poplar stands, the backup generator American settlers actually used, now appreciated only for its lumber and its shade. And here's the quiet irony: the same tree that frontier doctors stripped bark from to fight fevers is now the one homeowners call an arborist to trim away from their roof. The relationship flipped. The knowledge didn't die, and it just stopped being necessary. Until the next time supply lines break. This next one sits on your plate if you've ever eaten at a Japanese or Korean restaurant. And you probably had no idea what it was doing. Perilla, the allergy silencer, is the kind of plant that makes you question how much invisible medicine you've been eating without knowing it. Perilla frutescens, known as shiso in Japanese cooking and dulkai in Korean cuisine, is a leafy annual herb that has been cultivated across East Asia for at least 2,000 years. It shows up in sushi platters as a garnish, in Korean barbecue wrapped around grilled meat, in pickled plum preparations, and in dozens of traditional dishes where its presence is treated as both culinary and medicinal, because in East Asian food culture, that distinction barely exists. The plant itself looks like a cross between basil and mint. Square stems, broad serrated leaves, and a scent that's hard to pin down. Part anise, part cinnamon, part something green and sharp that doesn't have an English word. The leaves can be green or deep purple, slightly fuzzy on the underside. And when you rub one between your fingers, the oils come off immediately. Warm, aromatic, medicinal. The texture is soft, almost velvety. In a garden, perilla grows aggressively, self-seeds enthusiastically, and asks for almost nothing. It behaves like basil's wilder, more independent cousin. The compound driving perilla's reputation is rosmarinic acid, a polyphenol with documented anti-inflammatory and anti-allergic properties. Japanese clinical trials have specifically investigated perilla extract for seasonal allergic rhinitis, and the results have been consistent enough to generate real interest. One study published in a Japanese pharmacology journal found that perilla leaf extract significantly reduced nasal symptoms and inflammatory markers in allergy sufferers compared to placebo. The mechanism is straightforward in plain language. Rosmarinic acid inhibits certain inflammatory enzymes and suppresses the release of histamine and TNF-alpha, the chemical cascade that produces the sneezing, itching, and congestion of an allergic response. Think of it as turning down the volume on your immune system's overreaction. The practical scenario is seasonal allergies, the annual misery of pollen season that sends millions of people reaching for antihistamine pills with their drowsiness warnings and dry mouth side effects. Traditional East Asian use didn't frame it in those terms, but the application was the same. Perilla was included in meals during allergy season, brewed as a tea, and used in preparations specifically designed to ease respiratory and sinus discomfort. It's an antihistamine you can put on sushi. And you might have eaten it last Thursday without anyone mentioning that your garnish had clinical data behind it. Why forgotten in the West? Because it arrived here as a culinary novelty. That interesting leaf in the Japanese restaurant, and never got reframed as the medicinal herb it's been for 20 centuries. No one markets shiso as an allergy remedy in Western supermarkets. No pharmaceutical company can patent a leaf. And because the effect is gradual, dietary, and cumulative rather than dramatic and instant, it doesn't fit the model of take one pill, feel better in 30 minutes. The people eating it regularly have known for generations. Everyone else is reaching for the pill bottle and wondering why their mouth is dry. If you're realizing that what you thought was decoration is often medicine, and what you thought was a garnish is often therapy, you're catching on. And the next plant takes that realization somewhere genuinely strange. Soapwort, the living pharmacy soap, has one of the most bizarre dual identities of any plant on this list. Saponaria officinalis. Even the Latin name tells you what it does. Sapo means soap. This is a plant that was used across the Roman Empire, through medieval Europe, and into the industrial age as a literal cleaning agent. Wool workers used it to clean raw fleece. Museum conservators still use it to gently clean antique textiles and fragile tapestries. It produces a natural lather when the leaves or roots are crushed in water, real, foamy, functional soap made by a plant growing along riverbanks and roadsides. But here's what makes soapwort genuinely fascinating. The same saponins that produce that lather, the same chemistry that cleans fabric, have documented expectorant and mucolytic properties when used internally in traditional preparations. The European Pharmacopoeia has documented saponaria's use as an expectorant, and the mechanism makes intuitive sense once you understand it. Saponins reduce surface tension. In a washing context, that helps lift dirt from fibers. In a respiratory context, that helps thin and mobilize mucus stuck in the airways. The plant that cleans your wool cleans your lungs through the same basic chemistry. In the wild, soapwort is a perennial that grows 1 to 2 feet tall with smooth, lance-shaped leaves and clusters of pale pink to white 5-petaled flowers. It spreads aggressively by runners, colonizing roadsides, riverbanks, railway embankments, and disturbed ground. The flowers have a sweet, slightly spicy scent, like cloves mixed with something floral, especially noticeable in the evening. The roots are thick and fleshy, and when you break one, you can feel the slipperiness immediately. That soapy, slick texture that tells you the saponins are concentrated there. Rub a piece of root under running water and it actually lathers. It's uncanny. Traditional use for respiratory congestion involved carefully prepared decoctions of the root, typically simmered and taken in small controlled amounts. The operative word is carefully, because saponins in large doses can irritate the digestive tract. This is a plant that demands respect and dosage awareness, which is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when traditional knowledge gets condensed into headlines. The practical scenario is the persistent, eye mucus-heavy cough, the kind where everything feels stuck and unproductive. Traditional European herbalists reached for soapwort root in the same way they reached for other expectorant saponin-rich plants, and the underlying biochemistry supports the logic. One herbalist's reference noted that soapwort had been consistently employed in European folk medicine for catarrhal conditions of the upper respiratory tract. Why forgotten? Because it was too common, too weird, and too associated with laundry. When your primary cultural identity is the plant medieval workers used to wash sheep wool, nobody takes your respiratory credentials seriously. It got filed under cleaning instead of healing, and there it stayed, growing along every riverbank in the temperate world, ignored by everyone except textile conservators and a handful of herbalists who never lost the thread. It's the plant that cleans your lungs the same way it cleans fabric, same chemistry. On different application, and it's growing free along the nearest stream. Now, this next one has the kind of modern research backing that makes pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable because the compound has hundreds of trials and the plant it comes from costs almost nothing. Barberry, the golden antibiotic, is the plant that should make you angry, not because of what it does, but because of how thoroughly it's been overlooked, while the compound it contains has become one of the most researched natural molecules in modern pharmacology. Berberis vulgaris, a thorny shrub with small oval leaves, clusters of hanging yellow flowers in spring, and bright red oblong berries in fall that taste sharply sour, like a cranberry that went to war. It grows as ornamental hedging across suburban yards, in parks, along fence lines. The kind of plant people trim back without ever wondering what's inside it. What's inside it is berberine, and berberine has become one of the most clinically investigated plant compounds of the past 2 decades. The research is staggering in scope. Peer-reviewed clinical trials have examined berberine for glucose regulation, lipid metabolism, cardiovascular markers, antimicrobial activity, and gut health. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology evaluated data across multiple controlled studies and concluded that berberine showed significant effects on blood glucose and lipid parameters comparable to some first-line pharmaceutical interventions. That's not folk tradition, that's clinical data. But here's the part that warrants real attention. Berberine wasn't discovered in Barbary by modern scientists. It was identified as a core medicinal compound because traditional medical systems on 3 separate continents, Ayurveda in India, traditional Persian medicine in the Middle East, and multiple Native American tribal traditions, all independently valued berberine-containing plants for overlapping conditions: digestive infection, inflammation, and what traditional practitioners described as heat conditions or systemic imbalance. 3 independent discoveries, 3 separate continents, and thousands of years apart, all converging on the same yellow alkaloid. In the wild and in gardens, barberry is easy to identify. The inner bark and wood are a vivid yellow. Break a twig and you'll see it immediately, like the plant is advertising its berberine content. The berries are tart enough to make your mouth pucker, and traditionally they've been used in jams, rice dishes across Persian cuisine, and as a souring agent. The thorns are small but sharp. Barberry doesn't make it easy to harvest, which is fitting for a plant that seems to guard its value behind every kind of barrier. Traditional preparations include root bark decoctions and tinctures, used for digestive complaints, skin infections, and eye washes. The modern supplement industry has caught on to berberine itself, selling it in capsules at significant markup, while the plant it comes from grows in suburban hedgerows, largely ignored. A critical qualification: berberine has documented interactions with pharmaceutical medications, including drugs for blood pressure, blood sugar, and heart rhythm. This is not a casual supplement, and self-prescribing berberine, alongside prescription drugs without professional guidance, is genuinely risky. The potency that makes it clinically interesting also makes it pharmacologically active in ways that demand respect. Why forgotten? Because golden seal, another berberine-containing plant, got all the fame and the price tag, while barberry was dismissed as landscaping. The same compound, different marketing, and the shrub in the suburban yard costs nothing. It's a clinical trial favorite hiding in suburban hedgerows, and the $30 supplement bottle in the health food store contains a compound growing free in the nearest ornamental garden. We're past the familiar ones now. The plants coming next have battlefield histories, survival stories, and the kind of traditional pedigree that took centuries to build. This is where things get serious. Park looks different. The moment you understand that the flat tire weed has 3,000 years of Ayurvedic, Chinese, and Greek traditional use behind it, the driveway stops being just a driveway. This isn't about going back to some idealized past where everyone foraged and nobody needed doctors. That past didn't exist. Or people died of treatable conditions. Traditional medicine had limitations, and modern medicine has saved billions of lives. What this is about is recognizing that the transition from plant-based to synthetic medicine didn't happen because the plants stopped working. It happened because the economics changed. What could be patented was funded. What couldn't be patented was forgotten. And what was forgotten kept growing. In the cracks along the roadsides, in the garden beds, all on the rooftops, waiting for someone to remember. That rail yard in southern Ohio, the one from the beginning of this story, is still there. The goat's rue is still pushing through the rubble. The purple flowers are still blooming where nobody looks. But now you know what it is. Now you know what it made possible. And the next time you walk past a ditch full of unnamed green, past the plants you never learned to see, you'll know what you're really looking at. If you've stayed with this to here, you've already seen the pattern. Plants dismissed as common turned out to be documented. Plants ignored as decorative turned out to be therapeutic. Plants treated as weeds turned out to carry clinical data. Now we're entering the tier where the histories get dramatic, the traditional uses get extreme, and the modern validation hits different. These are the legendary ones. Spikenard, the bear medicine, carries a name that tells you exactly how seriously the people who used it took its power. Aurelia racemosa. In multiple Native American traditions, this plant was called bear medicine or life root. And the reason is rooted in one of the most remarkable pieces of ecological observation in ethnobotanical history. Indigenous communities across the eastern woodlands observed that black bears, upon emerging from hibernation after 5 months of fasting, on muscle atrophy and metabolic dormancy, would seek out and dig up spikenard roots as one of their first foods. Bears, weakened and depleted, after the longest fast a large mammal undergoes in the temperate world, chose this plant, and the people watching them took note. Spikenard grows in rich, shaded woodlands, the understory of deciduous forests across eastern North America. It's a large, sprawling perennial, sometimes reaching 5 feet wide, on with compound leaves and clusters of small, dark purple berries. The root is the medicinal part, thick, aromatic, with a warm, resinous scent that's somewhere between ginger and pine. Dig one up and you'll understand immediately why a bear would bother. The smell alone is potent, earthy, warm, alive. The texture is dense and fibrous, like concentrated forest floor. Traditional uses were extensive. Spikenard root was prepared as a decoction for respiratory congestion, used in poultices for skin conditions and joint pain, employed as a digestive tonic, and incorporated into sweat lodge preparations where steam carrying the root's volatile compounds was inhaled for respiratory clearing. In Appalachian folk herbalism, it was valued similarly, a go-to root for deep coughs, bronchial congestion, and the kind of chest tightness that settled in after cold, damp winters. The chemistry includes volatile oils, diterpene acids, ACE and other aromatic compounds with documented anti-inflammatory and expectorant properties. Research on Aurelia species has identified anti-inflammatory activity in laboratory settings, though human clinical trials specific to Aurelia racemosa remain limited. This is an important distinction to make clearly. The traditional use is deep, consistent, and ecologically corroborated. The modern clinical validation is emerging but not yet robust. On what we have is centuries of human observation plus an extraordinary ecological signal. Bears choosing this plant at their most vulnerable moment, plus preliminary pharmacological data that aligns with the traditional applications. Why forgotten? Because spikenard is a deep forest plant. It doesn't grow in disturbed ground or along roadsides. It requires shade, moisture, and patience. It can't be monocropped, mass-harvested, or standardized easily. It exists in the places most people don't go anymore. The interior forest, the old growth remnant, the places where the understory is still thick enough to support plants that require the whole ecosystem around them to thrive. Modern culture paved over its habitat and then forgot what was underneath. If a bear trusts it after 5 months of not eating, maybe pay attention. That's not a marketing slogan. That's ecological validation running deeper than any clinical trial. And if spikenard is the medicine that stayed in the forest, the next plant is the one that walked into your city and started dropping flowers on your sidewalk, carrying a secret that traditional Chinese medicine has known for centuries. Silk tree, the happiness bark, is growing in cities across the American South and Mid-Atlantic right now, and most people know it only as that tree with the pink, fluffy flowers. Albizia julibrissin. It lines streets, it grows in vacant lots. It's considered invasive in some states, and in traditional Chinese medicine, its bark has been used for centuries under the name He Huan Pi, which translates remarkably to collective happiness bark. That translation isn't poetic embellishment. In TCM, albizia bark has been prescribed for what classical texts describe as constrained emotions, melancholy, irritability, and disturbed sleep, a profile that maps closely onto what modern psychology would recognize as anxiety and depression. The Shen Nongben Cao Jing, one of the oldest Chinese pharmacopoeias dating to roughly the 1st century CE, lists albizia among plants that calm the spirit and bring joy. 2,000 years of documented use for emotional well-being, or from a tree that Americans consider a nuisance. The tree itself is stunning. Those signature flowers, pink, silky, radiating like tiny fireworks, bloom throughout summer, and have a sweet, honey-like fragrance that carries on warm evenings. The compound leaves are bipinnate, meaning feathery and fern-like, and they fold closed at night, a behavior called nyctinisty, as if the tree itself is resting. Touch the bark and it's smooth in young trees, becoming slightly roughened with age. The inner bark, when stripped and dried, has a mild, slightly sweet taste and a faintly resinous aroma. Pharmacological research has identified saponins and flavonoids in albizia bark, and Chinese pharmacological studies have investigated its anxiolytic and sedative properties. One study published in a Chinese pharmaceutical journal found that albizia bark extract demonstrated significant anxiolytic effects in animal models comparable to standard reference compounds. The mechanisms appear to involve modulation of serotonergic and GABAergic pathways, the same neurochemical systems targeted by modern antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications. In Ayurvedic tradition, related albizia species were also valued, used for stress recovery, emotional trauma, and as a restorative after periods of extreme physical or psychological strain. The convergence across two independent traditional systems, Chinese and Indian, on the same genus for the same emotional applications, is the kind of cross-cultural validation that demands attention. Traditional preparation is typically a decoction of the dried bark, simmered and taken as a tea. Some practitioners combine it with other calming herbs, and in TCM formulations, it often appears alongside herbs like Xuanzao Ren for sleep support. The practical context is the kind of low-grade, persistent emotional heaviness that sits below the threshold of clinical diagnosis, but above the level of "I'm fine," the modern epidemic of quiet unhappiness that pharmaceutical interventions don't always reach. Why forgotten in the West? Because albizia was imported as an ornamental tree in the 1740s, valued for its beauty and shade tolerance. Its bark medicine tradition traveled across oceans as a passenger, not as cargo. Nobody told the Americans who planted it along their streets that they were growing an antidepressant dropping pink flowers on their sidewalk. If this one shifts your perspective on what invasive species might actually be carrying, the next plant comes from the opposite world, deep, silent forests where something was quietly listed in the official pharmacopoeia, used for a century, and then removed without explanation. Pipsissewa, the deep forest kidney herb, has one of the most telling histories of any plant on this list, because it wasn't just folk medicine, it was official medicine. And then it wasn't. Chimaphila umbellata. The name comes from the Cree language, Pipsissewa, sometimes translated as, "it breaks into small pieces," a reference to its traditional use for breaking up kidney and bladder stones. This wasn't obscure knowledge, it was mainstream knowledge. Pipsissewa was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of recognized medicines, from the mid-19th century well into the early 20th century. Doctors prescribed it, pharmacists stocked it. The Cree, Ojibwe, and other First Nations peoples had been using it for generations before that, and colonial American settlers adopted it directly from indigenous knowledge and brought it into the formal medical system. The plant grows in dry pine and mixed coniferous forests across the Northern Hemisphere, from the Pacific Northwest to New England, across Northern Europe, and into Asia. It's low-growing, rarely more than a foot tall, with thick, shiny, dark green leaves arranged in whorls around the stem. The leaves are leathery and waxy to the touch, almost like small rhododendron leaves, and they have a distinctive wintergreen-like flavor when chewed. Mild, cooling, slightly astringent. On the small flowers are pink-tinged white, nodding downward, and appear in midsummer in loose clusters. Pipsissewa looks like it belongs in the forest floor, quiet, contained, understated. The active compound chimaphilin has demonstrated antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, and the broader chemical profile includes flavonoids, triterpenes, and phenolic compounds consistent with the traditional urinary tract applications. Indigenous use centered on kidney stones, urinary infections, and rheumatic complaints, conditions where the body needed something to clear, dissolve, or reduce inflammation in the urinary system. Colonial practitioners validated this use through observation and clinical application, and the plant earned its place in the formal pharmacopoeia based on documented effectiveness. Then, and this is the part that matters, as synthetic urinary antiseptics and anti-inflammatory drugs were developed in the early to mid-20th century. Pipsissewa was quietly removed from the pharmacopoeia, not because it stopped working, not because new evidence contradicted its use, because it was replaced. Synthetics were easier to standardize, manufacture, and distribute. The plant-based medicine was phased out in favor of the industrially scalable alternative, and within a generation, a remedy that doctors had prescribed and pharmacists had stocked simply vanished from professional awareness. This is a prescription drug that lost its badge but not its power. The plant still grows in those pine forests. The chemistry is unchanged. The traditional knowledge persists among herbalists and indigenous communities. What changed was the economic model, not the evidence. Herbalists who continue to work with Pipsissewa typically prepare it as a tea or tincture from the dried leaves, used for urinary tract support and mild kidney complaints. The preparation is gentle, the taste is pleasant, and the plant's history speaks for itself. Good enough for the official pharmacopoeia for decades, forgotten not because it failed, but because something more profitable arrived. If you're starting to notice a pattern, plants that worked being replaced not by better plants, but by patentable molecules, hold that thought. Because the next entry is the one that Olympic coaches were secretly stockpiling while everyone else was cursing it for popping their bicycle tires. Puncture vine, the gladiator's edge, might be the most universally despised plant in the American Southwest, and that reputation is exactly what makes its medicinal history so shocking. Tribulus terrestris. If you've ever had a bicycle tire go flat on a desert trail or stepped barefoot on something that felt like a tiny medieval weapon, you've probably met puncture vine's seed pods. Those vicious, spiny little capsules designed by evolution to hitch rides on animal hooves and human shoes. The plant sprawls flat against gravel, roadsides, parking lot edges, and disturbed ground, and it is hated with a consistency that borders on religious conviction. Now consider this. That same plant has been used in Ayurvedic medicine for thousands of years under the name gokshura, valued as a kidney tonic, urinary support herb, and vitality enhancer. In traditional Chinese medicine, it appears as Bai Ji Li, used for liver qi stagnation, headaches, and eye conditions. In Greek athletic tradition, associated tribulus with physical strength and endurance. 3 medical systems, 3 continents, thousands of years, all converging on the flat tire weed. In the wild, puncture vine grows in a distinctive rosette pattern, hugging the ground with hairy stems and small compound leaves resembling tiny locust or acacia foliage. The flowers are small, 5-petaled, and yellow, surprisingly pretty for something so universally cursed. Untouch the stems and they're slightly fuzzy, warm from the baked ground they press against. The seed pods are the defining feature, hard, spiny, and engineered to puncture. The chemistry centers on steroidal saponins, particularly protodioxin. Research has investigated tribulus for kidney and urinary tract support, cardiovascular markers, and physical performance. In the 1970s and 1980s, Bulgarian sports scientists reportedly administered tribulus extracts to Olympic athletes as part of performance optimization programs, and this connection became the basis for tribulus's later commercial explosion in the supplement industry. Here's where responsible qualification matters significantly. The testosterone-boosting claims that dominate tribulus marketing are substantially overstated. Multiple clinical reviews have found little evidence that tribulus meaningfully increases testosterone levels in healthy men. What is better documented is its traditional and research-supported role in urinary and kidney health, its effects on certain cardiovascular markers, and its historical use as a general tonic. One review noted that tribulus showed consistent traditional use for urinary lithiasis across multiple pharmacopoeias, with emerging but not yet definitive modern clinical support. the practical scenario is more nuanced than the supplement industry would have you believe. This is not a magic performance enhancer. It's a plant with deep traditional roots in kidney and urinary support, some interesting cardiovascular data, and a commercial reputation that outpaced its evidence in the testosterone department. The most honest framing is that traditional systems valued it for specific applications, modern research partially supports those applications, and the rest is marketing. The most hated plant in your driveway might be the one Olympic coaches were stockpiling, but the reasons they valued it are probably different from what the supplement ads claim. We've now passed through the legendary tier, battlefield medicine, pharmacopoeia history, Olympic secrecy, and ancestral knowledge systems stretching back millennia. What's coming in the final act is different. It's about reclamation. Everything you've seen so far on this list, every dismissed weed, every overlooked ornamental, every suburban hedge-hiding clinical data, leads here. The final act is not about discovering more powerful plants. It's about recognizing that the power was always distributed, always accessible, always growing where you could reach it. These last two plants aren't the strongest on the list. They're the ones that prove the point most completely, that herbal knowledge doesn't require a wilderness expedition or a specialty supplier. Sometimes it's sitting on a roof. Sometimes it's pressed between the pages of a very old book. Houseleek, the roof guardian, has one of the most peculiar histories of any plant in the European tradition, and it starts with an emperor's order, Semper Vivum Tectorum. The Latin name tells you what it does and where it lives. Semper Vivum means always alive, and Tectorum means of roofs. This is a plant that was grown on rooftops, deliberately, by mandate. Charlemagne, emperor of the Carolingian Empire, issued a decree in his Capitulare de Villis around 800 CE, requiring that houseleek be planted on the roofs of buildings throughout his domain. The stated reasons were both practical and symbolic: lightning protection and medicinal availability. The lightning protection belief is likely folklore. The medicinal tradition is not. Across the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and Northern Europe, houseleek has been used for centuries as a topical treatment for burns, insect stings, ear infections, and skin inflammation. The method is simple: split a fleshy leaf open and apply the cool, mucilaginous gel directly to the affected area. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same application model as aloe vera, from a completely different plant family, developed independently in a completely different part of the world. The plant itself is unmistakable: thick, succulent rosettes of pointed leaves, often tinged with red or purple at the tips, growing in dense clusters that cling to stone, tile, and thin soil. It's essentially indestructible, surviving frost, drought, scorching sun, and complete neglect. The leaves are cool and juicy when broken, with a faintly astringent, almost bland taste and a smooth, gel-like interior. The texture is the key. That soothing, cooling gel is what makes it work as an immediate topical remedy. The chemistry includes malic acid, polyphenols, and mucilaginous compounds with documented anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. European ethnobotanical studies have recorded its consistent use across multiple regions for the same applications: burns, stings, minor skin injuries, and the mechanism aligns with the tradition. The cooling gel reduces inflammation on contact, while the polyphenols provide mild antimicrobial activity. Why forgotten? Because it's too simple, too available, and too odd. A plant that lives on roofs, that looks like a succulent decoration, that you apply by simply cracking it open. There's no pharmaceutical pathway there. No extraction, no standardization, no bottle, no label. Just a plant on a roof and the knowledge that when you burn your hand, you reach up and grab a leaf. Charlemagne put it on every roof in his empire. You can put it in a pot on your windowsill. The knowledge didn't change, the roofs did. And now, the final plant, the one that ties the entire thread together. And it was hiding, of all places, between the pages of a Bible. Costmary, the Bible leaf, is the plant that nobody remembers, and that's exactly what makes it the perfect ending to this list. Tanacetum balsamita. In medieval monasteries across Europe, the same institutions that served as libraries, hospitals, breweries, and pharmacies rolled into one. Costmary was one of the most commonly cultivated herbs. It was grown in physic gardens alongside lavender, sage, and betony, used as a digestive bitter, an antiseptic wound wash, a strewing herb for floors, and a flavoring agent in ales before hops became dominant in brewing. But its most distinctive use was uniquely medieval, and it's the one that gave the plant its lasting nickname. Monks and parishioners pressed the long, silver-green, balsam-scented leaves between the pages of their Bibles, both as a fragrant bookmark and, reportedly, as something to sniff during long sermons to stay alert. Bible leaf, a plant used simultaneously as medicine, preservative, bookmark, and smelling salt. That's the kind of versatility that only exists in a world where every plant in your garden is expected to earn its place 3 different ways. The leaves are large, up to a foot long in good conditions, oval with a soft, velvety texture, and a scent that's distinctive and hard to forget. Warm, balsamic, somewhere between mint and camphor with a sweet, slightly musky undertone. It's the kind of scent that clings to your fingers after you touch the plant, pleasant and persistent. In colonial America, Costmary made the transatlantic journey with early settlers and continued to serve the same functions: ale flavoring, stomach remedy, and fragrant household herb. It was sometimes called alicost for its role in brewing, a name that survived in regional dialects long after the practice faded. The chemistry includes parthenolides, the same class of compounds found in feverfew, which has documented anti-inflammatory and migraine-preventive properties, along with camphor and other volatile compounds with antimicrobial activity. The parthenolide connection is significant because it links Costmary to a better-known medicinal plant through shared chemistry, suggesting that the medieval monks who valued Costmary for headache and digestive complaints were accessing the same compounds that modern research has validated in a related species. Our traditional preparation was typically as a tea, the dried leaves steeped in hot water for digestive upset, mild headache, or general tonic purposes. The taste is pleasant, balsamic, and slightly bitter. An accessible herbal tea that doesn't require acquired taste tolerance. In the garden, Costmary is an easy perennial, tolerating poor soil, partial shade, and general neglect. It spreads by runners and, once established, is nearly impossible to eradicate. It's the kind of plant that wants to be in your garden and will stay whether you pay attention to it or not. Why forgotten? Because hops replaced it in brewing, aspirin replaced it for headaches, air fresheners replaced it for scent, bookmarks replaced it for Bibles. Every single function Costmary served was individually displaced by a specialized modern product, and the plant that did 5 things adequately was replaced by 5 things that each did one thing efficiently. The monastery herb that did everything was made obsolete, not by failure but by fragmentation. It's a medieval pharmacy that doubles as a bookmark, and the monastery gardens where it grew are the direct ancestors of the pharmacies you drive to today. Thousands of years of traditional use across continents. Clinical trials, pharmacological investigations, compound analyses, and the slow, steady work of modern science confirming what herbalists, healers, monks, soldiers, and grandparents already knew. Not all of it is proven to the same standard. Some of these plants carry robust clinical data. Berberine in barberry, rosmarinic acid in perilla, platycodon D in balloon flower. Some carry deep traditional knowledge that modern research is only beginning to investigate. Spikenard's respiratory uses, Pipsissewa's urinary applications, houseleek's topical tradition. Some sit in between, where the historical consistency is compelling and the scientific evidence is emerging but not yet definitive. That's honest. That's how knowledge actually works. Not as a binary switch between proven and useless, but as a spectrum that moves when someone decides to fund the question. What this list is not is a prescription. Nothing here replaces professional medical care. Nothing here should be self-administered as a substitute for a diagnosed treatment plan. Where plants interact with medications, and some of them do, seriously, that interaction deserves the same respect you'd give to any pharmacologically active substance, because that's what these plants are. What this list is, what it was always meant to be, is a lens change, a way of seeing what's already there. Because the moment you realize that the ornamental shrub in your neighbor's yard contains one of the most researched alkaloids in modern phytopharmacology, something shifts. The moment you learn that the tree in the park was once standard-issue fever medicine for Civil War surgeons, the park looks different. The moment you understand that the flat-tire weed has 3,000 years of Ayurvedic, Chinese, and Greek traditional use behind it, the driveway stops being just a driveway. This isn't about going back to some idealized past where everyone foraged and nobody needed doctors. That past didn't exist. People died of treatable conditions. Traditional medicine had limitations, and modern medicine has saved billions of lives. What this is about is recognizing that the transition from plant-based to synthetic medicine didn't happen because the plant stopped working. It happened because the economics changed. What could be patented was funded, or what couldn't be patented was forgotten. And what was forgotten kept growing. In the cracks, along the roadsides, in the garden beds, on the rooftops, waiting for someone to remember. That rail yard in southern Ohio, the one from the beginning of this story, is still there. The goat's rue is still pushing through the rubble. The purple flowers are still blooming where nobody looks. But now you know what it is. Now you know what it made possible. And the next time you walk past a ditch full of unnamed green, past the plants you never learned to see, you'll know what you're really looking at.